a lecture. Actually, this is although it's called the 15th anniversary series of lectures, this one's not a lecture, it's a dialogue. And it's a dialogue between three people whom I know very well and whom I admire greatly. And two of the honorable judges are no strangers to anyone at HSB. We've appeared before them, we've argued before them. They are responsible for some of the most cutting edge decisions in the law. And today, we are all faced with challenges to our various freedoms. And the question is,
what they said was that, look,
how are things going to go from here? Are we, how far do the constitutional protections actually stand and protect the rights that we have? We had a lecture earlier this morning where we heard that the purpose of a constitution is to limit the rights of the state and to define the rights of citizens. So the most fundamental freedom, the freedom to express oneself, the freedom of speech, is something which we are going to explore today. We've divided the topic into three subtopics, where we talk first about the print media. We invite the three distinguished panelists to share their views on one aspect of print media, then we move to the broadcast media, and then we move to social media. And we'll have questions and answers after that. Some ground rules. Please do not raise any questions or raise any topics which pertain to facts of an active case or which are a pending case. Let us be conscious that Justice Chakdar and Justice Swaminathan have consented to participate, conscious of their high office, and therefore let us make sure that in no way are they embarrassed. So with those ground rules and with no further ado, we shall head into our dialogue. So the first question which I wish to place for the panel is one of print media. And the issue here is a free press in a democracy versus the right of citizens to protect against defamation. The reason we chose defamation is that the right of citizens to protect themselves against pre-publication censorship is very well established. There are numerous judgments of the Supreme Courts of India and the US. We've seen Abrams, we've seen Debs. And so pre-publication censorship is something where the law is fairly well established. What happens after publication? Can a person, can defamation or threatened defamation be the basis for a person to demand that a person who seeks to say something not say it any further or take down what has already been said? We've heard of the phrase chilling effect. Is defamation something which can be used to have a chilling effect on free speech? These are the topics I wish to explore. I would first, on the express orders of Justice Swaminathan, I request Justice Chakdar to open the topic.
Srinath, Hari Shankar, and everyone at HSB. I'm also grateful for Justice Swaminathan agreeing to participate in this webinar with me, and as well as Mr. Sanjay Pinto. I must also thank the members of the Madras High Court Bar who have once again got together and, in a sense, asked me to convene on this webinar. I did a webinar only about 2 weeks ago, the Madras Bar, which, in a sense, as I was just telling Srinath a little while ago, sends me, instills in me a feeling of sort of foreboding that there is a viewer's fatigue which is setting in vis-a-vis webinars. But having said so, I'm consented to convene on this webinar. Let me just express a couple of opening remarks generally, and then get back to what Srinath raised, because there has to be contextualization, according to me, with regard to how do people generally understand this particular article in the Constitution, which according to me is actually a jewel in the crown of the fundamental rights which the Constitution makers have bestowed or vested on the polity. As we all know, insofar as Article 19(1)(a) was concerned, we started on a very high note where this concept of reasonable restrictions was not there. In fact, there was a suggestion, as scholars and historians tell us, to include the word sedition as a restrictive clause in the article. It was when people of great merit and parliamentarians who had the necessary intellectual wherewithal intervened, such as Govind Seth, Somnath Lahiri, when this entire thing was dropped. And we had the way Article 19(1) was in 1950 when we adopted the Constitution. But then very soon, and it is very interesting because you need to understand that restrictions by the state have come in from time to time, right after we attained independence. So very soon in 1951, when you had a challenge to the right of the press to publish the Rumesh Thapar case and the Bhushan case, that we ended up amending the Constitution, and the first amendment in 1951 was the one which dealt with Article 19(1)(a), and we then introduced the restrictive clause of reasonable restrictions, and as we all know, it has 8 slots. So your reasonable restrictions are, in a sense, required to be connected to the 8 slots. Interestingly, since we start with the topic of freedom of press, unlike the American Constitution, it doesn't find mention in 19(1)(a). But it is the courts which have intervened and expanded the scope of this article to include the freedom of expression and extended the protection to the press, because they are the disseminators of information, and it is the right of the citizenry to know, so to say in a lay language, as to what is going on and be informed about the governance and other aspects which concern his life. So freedom of press attained a foothold through Article 19(1)(a) very early in our Constitution. One of the outstanding cases which now is being criticized is Sakal Papers. And we've discussed why Sakal Papers is being criticized now. Then, of course, we had cases like the Bennett Coleman, Indian Express. And very recently, we've had Anuradha Bhasin. All of them reiterate the right of the press to publish what they think the citizenry needs to know. The question is, then why is it that the press almost every time feels under some kind of pressure, and they have to come back to court again and again, and the courts have to reiterate the principles that they set forth? The problem here is that there is always this tension between, let's say, the dispensation of the day and the press. And it is because of this tension that we have these cases, whether it's in the form of criminal defamation or a civil action or defamation being triggered. More often than not, where it is concerning the press, resort is taken to criminal defamation. The question is, should the courts permit it? And I must say, there are, and once again, Madras High Court somehow has been at the forefront of this. Whether it was the R. Rajgopal case, which actually took in a lot from American jurisprudence, when they applied the New York Times, the Sullivan test, and the New York Times versus the United States of America test, or to very important judgments that the Madras High Court has recently developed sort of delivered, in this area. One is by my very good friend, Mr. Swaminathan, who's with us, in Sandhya Ravi Shankar's case. And the other is Justice Kudus's judgment in Enram's case. Both these judgments are outstanding for what? Firstly, they reiterate that you cannot use the criminal law to suppress what is disagreeable. The entire purpose of Article 19(1) to my mind is to say, as they say, to the emperor that he wears no clothes. And when I say emperor, it means people in authority, people who are heads of institutions, which includes the courts and other institutions. And it is only the press which can show you that mirror, and that cannot be done away by triggering a criminal process. So what Justice Swaminathan said, and I'm just paraphrasing it, and he may correct me because he's the author of the judgment, that you have this beautiful array of law laid out, and yet you have a case being triggered against someone who's saying something which is in the interest of the citizenry. In this case, it was illegal beach sandmining. And what he said made a lot of sense to me, and I'm sure to a lot of his colleagues and others who are in other courts sitting as judges, that if you do not use the power, the high power that the law gives judges, then it is, as he says, quote unquote, useless tinsel. The second case, which is more recent, which is a batch of petitions, which again the Madras High Court did the same thing, quashing all criminal proceedings. So therefore, at the end of the day, according to me, this tension will continue to subsist till such time the courts make it abundantly clear that this is a no-go area. If you cannot have, as in R. Rajgopal, the Supreme Court said, a prior restraint, surely, and this is something that Supreme Court will have to deal with, should you have allowed them, or the ones who want to trigger criminal process, to continue with it after publication? Now, I know we have a Supreme Court judgment which has upheld the constitutional validity of Section 499 and 500, which is the Subramanian Swami's case. But even there, a window has been left open, which is what I think Justice Swaminathan used, is that you can still approach the High Courts under 226 or 482 for quashing the summons. So courts are cognizant of the good that comes with a vibrant press, the robustness that comes with a vibrant press, and that if you don't have the press which stands up and says disagreeable things or shows you the mirror, then the entire ethos of liberal democracy, which is the underpinning ethos of our constitution, will fail. So these are my opening remarks. Srinath, you can call upon Justice Swaminathan and Sanjay, and let's see what they have to say.
Justice Swaminathan, request you to please speak.
Yes. Good evening, Justice Shakta, Sanjay Pinto, Srinath, and everyone who have tuned in. I'm delighted that Justice Shakdar has been unequivocal in saying the expression emperor would include courts and judges also. I must applaud him for taking such a view, because I was a little surprised when Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul felt a little otherwise in his recent talk to the Madras Bar Association. I'm conscious that my friend Srinath said the attendees are not to embarrass, but I think that embargo will not apply to the panelists. When, see, Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul had given heartbreaking judgments in M.F. Hussain case and Perumal Murugan. I think the same yardstick should be applied when it comes to courts also. Of course, when it comes to courts, the courts say we can't be scandalized. Of course, just as nobody can be scandalized, nobody can be defamed, courts also can't be scandalized. But it is a fact that there is corruption in judiciary, there is bias in some judges also. And if press were to expose it, and if they are to face the threat of criminal contempt, then where do we go? Of course, I must make one confession here. Some 2 years back, I had given a sort of interim protection to a pregnant woman who was the daughter of the main accused in a major scam. The one paper, I don't want to name it, it's a very leading paper in India. In their national edition, in the first page, they said I had given anticipatory bail to the main accused, and it came under the banner heading, makes a killing. And I was aghast, and I promptly issued a notice to the editor and the journalist and said how he can report the order in such a way so as to scandalize me. And I said, why not refer the matter to the DB for taking criminal contempt proceedings? And the journalist appeared and the management appeared through a counsel, and they said the usual sorry, and they closed the proceedings on that day itself. But but now, you know, some 2 years later, and I am having a serious rethinking. Of course, Constitution 19.2 is not going to be amended tomorrow. But then we judges can take a vow that we will not resort to this criminal contempt proceedings when it comes to press. I do not want to speak for others, but to this audience, I now give an undertaking. Whatever they may say about me in future, let it be the most scandalizing thing also, I will not take recourse. There is some interruption.
I think it's unintentional. Please proceed, Judge.
Okay. And I think I would not take recourse to criminal contempt ever in future against a journalist or against the press. And if due to senility or forgiveness I forget, the lawyer can definitely remind me of the undertaking that I have now given. So I feel the next major step in this branch of law could be this letting this criminal contempt jurisdiction to fall into disuse, even if it is not formally deleted or amended from the Constitution or the statute book. So that would be my first point. My second point is a bit nostalgic. See, I have always taken the view that Article 19(1)(a) should be expansively construed and Article 19(2) should be confined, limited to the shortest possible space. But then, how I came to take such a view? There was one transformative moment in my life that shaped this stand of mine. And I'll tell you what is that. I think it was sometime in 2004. I had by then migrated to Madurai from Chennai. In that sense, I am also a migrant worker. And if I talk about that, Srinath will certainly mute me. All right, now coming back to the brief on hand. a a friend of mine came. He was a very famous writer, very great writer. Of course, not a famous one, because greatness and fame are not necessarily correlative. He had been lampooned rather harshly by another great critic. This man said that you must teach that critic a lesson. Therefore, I wrote out a legal notice and issued to him. I told him, if you don't apologize unequivocally and unconditionally, rest assured, I am filing a criminal contempt for defamation in some magistrate court in South Tamil Nadu. See, this critic was a man in his middle 60s. He was a resident of Madipakam in Chennai. And in 2 weeks, I got a handwritten inland letter from him. He asked me, what have I done? I have expressed certain views against your client. All right, let your client explain his stand. Let him attack me by his counter views. Why are you threatening me with a criminal case? See, this is like a boxing ring or a wrestling ring. I am ready to fight with you with my bare hands. You must also fight with me only with your bare hands. If you take out a knife or brandish a revolver, what I can do? I will have to run for my life. And since you are saying you will file a criminal case against me, friend, I am apologizing to you straight away, unconditionally, in whatever terms you want. I am ready to apologize. Please don't file a case against me. And that was the content of his reply. Friends, I have been a lawyer for about 26 years. There have been moments when I have felt so proud of myself. There have been moments when I have felt sad. There have been moments when I have felt depressed. But this was one moment I felt very small. That day, I realized views must be met only with counter views. That's all, nothing else. And do you know what I did? I persuaded my client to drop the issue. And that weekend, I went to Chennai, straight to the critic's house in the early morning and rang the bell. He opened the door. He asked me, sir, who are you? I introduced myself. He felt as if a Buddha had appeared before you. Sir, I had apologized to you. Why are you coming and troubling me in person? That was what he asked me. I said, sir, I have not come to trouble you. I have come to do a Sashtanga Namaskaram to you. He was stunned. And seeing that I was carrying a bag full of fruits, he let me in. I handed over the fruits to him, did a real Namaskaram to him, and left the house immediately thereafter. See, that was a defining moment in my life. That day I decided Article 19(1)(a) will be viewed by me in a very expansive manner, and 19(2) will be viewed by me in a very restrictive manner. And that was why I decided to stand by Perumal Murugan. Now, Perumal Murugan was a very good writer who has authored a number of books, fiction, non-fiction, all types. And when he was in trouble, he came home and he told me that he has been summoned by the district collector for a peace meeting. He was not in an emotional state to go alone. And I decided to accompany him. In fact, I'm not sharing a secret. Everybody knows my background. The movement was led by some of my friends, those who were opposed to Murugan. But I decided to stand by Murugan because I felt Murugan has the right to say what he wants to say, the right of a creative writer. Therefore, that was another experience of mine. And after becoming a judge, an interesting case came before me. Dinamalar was the petitioner. A cartoon had appeared in Dinamalar, lampooning DMK. Kalaignar Karunanidhi was portrayed as that cab seller and the DMK volunteers as monkeys. So one DMK worker filed a criminal defamation case against the magazine and the cartoonist. When the quash petition came before me, I said, yes, nobody has a right to defame another person. Fine. But then, what is the yardstick? What is the content? Can you uniformly apply this principle? See, the job of the cartoonist is to lampoon, to ridicule. Therefore, the yardstick that you would apply in any other case cannot be applied in the same measure to a cartoonist. Yeah, therefore, so defining the law, I quashed the entire proceedings. So, from 2004 onwards, I have taken a consistent position on this, and that's why when Srinath said, Judge, you have to speak on this subject, even though I was quite nervous to share the platform with Mr. Shakdar and Sanjay Pinto, I still came forward because this topic is something dear to me. But today I feel like that cameo actor or somebody who's playing guest appearance, because this film has, some films get to be released on a Diwali day when several other blockbusters are also released. See, today at 4 o'clock, Gautam Bhatia is on a webinar. At 5 p.m., our Chief Justice AP Sahi Jay is addressing a webinar. So this film has been released at the same time, and I feel I'm like a cameo actor in that. Anyway, it's a delight to be a part of this program, and I'll come again. Now over to Sanjay Pinto.
Sanjay, please.
Thank you, Your Lordship. Thank you, Srinath. First of all, my good wishes to HSP partners on their 15th year milestone. Congratulations. My respect for both Justice Shakdar and Justice Swaminathan has gone up tenfold after listening to them, especially Justice Swaminathan's personal anecdote that he shared with us. Having been in the media, in fact, I've been a journalist technically for 32 years of my life, right from class 8 in school, and having made that transition from the newsroom to the courtroom. I think there's an interruption. Yes. Having made that transition from the newsroom to the courtroom, I, for one, believe that the laws of defamation are used more as a sword rather than as a shield, as it's meant to be. The chilling effect that was last laid down even in the Shreya Singhal case, in that when it struck down the Section 66A of the IT Act, that still holds good. So when a defamation case is filed against the media, and I'll confine myself to the print media, we must understand that Article 19(1)A is not just for the journalists, but it extends to the readers as well. And what is hit when a defamation case is filed against, either civil or criminal defamation, when it's filed against a journalist, against a publication, is also 19(1)G, because that journalist and those editors have to prove to the court that trial is a punishment and their entire work is affected. So 19(1)G is also hit, it's not just 19(1)A. I think it is, and that's the reason, that's the rationale behind the Supreme Court in the Subramanian Swamy case not decriminalizing defamation, because it said that they need to dovetail free speech with the right to reputation, and also that sufficient safeguards exist when it comes to quashing a case. That said, in fact, I'm in awe of these two judgments that Justice Shakdar pointed out. The grievance redressal officer, in fact, Sandhya Ravishankar, I know her when she was a student in ACJ, and we wanted to hire her. Actually, we came across as a very spunky journalism student. Here again, I think, I would like to quote Lord Denning, who once pronounced in classic prose, if you don't want your dirty linen to be washed in public, then it's very simple. Please don't have dirty linen at all. This whole concept of free censorship is a direct affront to free speech. The role of the media is adversarial. It is to speak truth to power. The moment you have a Damocles sword of defamation hanging over your head, you are in great measure crippling the function of the media, and you're putting that watchdog that is meant to bark and bite also as well under a muzzle. So that is something that I completely do not agree with. I believe that these two judgments, in fact, the grievance redressal officer versus Krishnamurti of the Madras High Court, Justice Swaminathan's judgment, I think very clearly he said that the court must exercise its inherent powers, not just exercise it, but also exert itself a little. Very often I hear people saying that 482 of the CRPC is is a very narrow power. Actually, the wording of that provision is very clear. It says there should be no limit on the power of the court to prevent any abuse of the process of law. Secondly, and also the Sullivan principle that it referred to, we must understand that when it comes to the media and the process of daily news gathering, there has to be a margin for error. It is not possible in the heat of the moment to be 100% accurate all the time. Not all your sources may be accurate. A source may have given you information 10 times in the past which turned out to be accurate, and then suddenly in the 11th occasion it may be wrong. The documents that you get may not be actually genuine. So there is scope for error. So what is incorrect is not necessarily defamatory. And I think that was an underlying principle in the Sullivan case, that unless there's a rash disregard for the truth, then I think we need to stop being prickly pears, as it were. The other very important case that Justice Shakdar pointed out in the N. Ram case, I'm very glad that someone has finally actually made that distinction between public servants and citizens. I've always believed that 199 CRPC has been violative of Article 14. Why should we have two categories of citizens? Public servants and ordinary citizens, because people can just file without going to go through the public prosecutor and seek to wreak vengeance on journalists who call a spade, who rattle skeletons in the cupboard. So therefore, that distinction made between 199.2 and 199.6, I think that is very important. So I, for one, believe that when it comes to the freedom of the press, defamation law should be the last resort. Unfortunately, today it's used to actually intimidate journalists. Legal notices are sent. 100 crore defamation, damages are claimed. People are filing cases in different parts of the country. Like you have check bounce cases. Why can't it be confined only to the place where the journalist resides? Today, because people say that online media can be viewed anywhere, television can be viewed anywhere. I'll reserve these thoughts for the next segment. Why should a journalist have 10, 15 cases filed against him and having to appear in all these places? Also, in terms of reporters, I'm not talking about editors here. A defamation case is no longer a badge of honor for a journalist. It's of great nuisance value, because then the editor, time will come when a journalist has too many cases against him, will say, this guy is all the time going to the court. What is he going to file for us? So his livelihood will at some point be hit. That's why I refer to Article 19(1)(g). So it's important for us to understand that, again, free press is not just a freedom of speech for the journalist. Sometimes the person who pays the piper calls the tune. The freedom of speech is not absolute. We know there are reasonable restrictions, but sometimes it's the newspaper owners, the newspaper barons who call the shots, and journalists, who are at the cutting edge of news gathering, they suffer collateral damage. So I think it's important for us to understand, again, to reiterate that the trial is a punishment, and we should develop a thick skin. That's exactly the phrase Justice Mutosh used. That public servants should be a little thick-skinned. Why are they being so hypersensitive to any criticism? Because we have about 10 exceptions in the law of criminal defamation, and fair comment is seldom considered when people file defamation cases. They fly off the handle, they file cases, and then they say, let the person go to court, let them get it quashed, let them have their presence dispensed with. How often does it happen? How often do we have judges like Justice Shakdar and Justice Swaminathan who take such a fair view? And actually, I would say that these judgments should be circulated to every journalism student in the country and every law student in the country, because these two judges have stepped into the shoes of the common citizen while dispensing justice.
Thanks, Sanjay. I think there's a lot to learn from there. Justice Shakdar, you hinted at what Justice Holmes said, where there must be a free exchange of ideas which must compete with each other in the marketplace. And Justice Swaminathan, you too mentioned that ultimately 19(2) is an exception and must be constricted and constrained to the extent possible. And Sanjay, I'd like to develop on your idea to carry us forward to the next segment. Now, one of the key tests for restraints on free speech with respect to the press in the print media is some filtering between the actual generation of the information and the publication thereof. Broadcast media is something which is recent, and the tests which we have evolved in the common law over the centuries for defamation or other things for the print media, I'm eager to hear your views on how far we can extend these to the broadcast media. For instance, in traditional defamation, you have the concept of publication of defamatory information. Therefore, a person who publishes is as culpable as the person who makes the defamatory statement. But a broadcaster who's doing a live broadcast, there is no scope for any filtering. So that is one end of the dynamic. On the other end, I mean, I don't need to tell all of you about the kind of programs we see. And Sanjay, I know you're from NDTV, but we have live discussions of cases. Sometimes irreparable damage is done through live broadcast. How do we balance these competing interests? Justice Shakhtar, your views, please.
So, Srinath, the point is that we need to choose between, as you rightly said, two competing issues that arise. The fact that media needs to discuss a particular issue, and if I've understood you rightly, the manner in which it is discussed. So, say suppose you take a criminal case where even before an FIR is lodged, or if an FIR is lodged even before a charge sheet is lodged, there is a complete trial on electronic media. Is that fair? All of you are aware that Supreme Court was faced with this issue and a very knotty problem with Justice Kapade, if I am not mistaken. After discussing the case law, did try to hem it in a little, but realizing that there is that power in Article 19(1)(a), he tilted towards that and allowed for discussion. So therefore, you have to be very careful. I know there are very disagreeable discussions, not of the kind that we are talking about, where you disagree in the sense that you express a view or you are critical of a particular setup, regime, dispensation. But issues which concern, say in a criminal case, an individual, where the judge who would hear the case next day, whether we like it or not, could get impacted. I'll give you an example that happened in Delhi. I was still a lawyer, and I was briefed in a matter to appear before a judge who had a criminal roster, where a bank employee had an FIR filed against him, and the bank was supporting the employee, and they had moved under 482 for caution. Now, the case against the bank employee was only this, that he had allowed some assets to be sold. The complainant was obviously the debtor, that he had allowed some assets to be sold at a song, so to say, from the point of view of the debtor, and therefore he had filed a complaint saying, he's impacted my interest, there is a criminal angle to this, etc., etc. So therefore we went to court in a 482. But when my case was taken up, the judge actually flew off the handle, and that's not overstating my case. Why I'm saying so is, and this was a judge who had got promoted to the Delhi High Court from the district court, and he would have done innumerable criminal cases and caution cases even in the High Court. He started by telling me what is happening to the society, what are people doing to children, etc. And I said, Judge, please pause. Mine is a case involving a banker, and a complainant is some debtor. I've got nothing to do with children, and therefore I don't know where it is coming from. So he said, no, I'm aware of your case. But in the morning, he had read a newspaper about this teacher being almost lynched by a crowd because she was accused of showing pornography to children. And the judge was so impacted by that news item that he, in a sense, lost his composure in dealing with a matter which had nothing to do with this. And of course, he dismissed our petition, etc., etc. And he wrote in the judgment aspects which had nothing to do with the case. Therefore, sometimes you don't think that once it's over in the High Court, you get something in the Supreme Court. Of course, I told the clients that because he's written about extraneous issues, you still have a glimmer of hope in the next spot. But the point that I was trying to make here is, Srinath, you are right. Even trained minds get impacted by what is shown by these kind of discussions on live TV. And you're right, there is no filtering. And the story which I did tell you didn't end here, because ultimately they found that the teacher was wrongly being accused and she was almost lynched. Wrongly being accused of having shown pornographic material to children. She could have died because of this news item on television, where the crowd got incited, etc., etc. So what do we do? Do we stop this, or should we have self-regulation? According to me, it is irritating. It's irksome. It's sometimes, your skin starts crawling the way aspects are discussed on television, especially to people who are instructed in law. But I would still say the better course is for self-regulation. The journalists themselves would have to convene and perhaps draw up a self-regulation, the TV journalist, a self-regulation norm as to how these aspects have to be discussed. In England, I'm told that the chief constable does not disclose the name of the accused till something equivalent to a charge sheet is filed. In India, somehow, and Sanjay will be able to bear us out, the beat journalists are told about the accused even before an FIR, even when there is a complaint. So therefore, according to me, you need to, because what happens after years of this, media trial, as they call it, the man gets acquitted. What happens that because of media trial, a trained judge gets impacted. It's no longer good to say, in good old days, some judges used to say, I don't read the morning newspaper. I don't know how far it's true. Whether you read it or not, some member of your family would have read and said, set it on the dining table or on the drawing room while you are having coffee and said, this is what happened, Appa, or this is what happened, Amma, and you know what is going on, or your colleagues will tell you that. So therefore, I would still think that the best way forward is for self-regulation. If you enter this area, there is no stopping. Because once you regulate it by way of a statute, then it will have pernicious effects. And they would take away this very, very vibrant right, which I think the journalists need to introspect and regulate. That's my view on this.
Thank you, Judge. Justice Swaminathan.
In fact, Justice Shagdar has beautifully put it. Justice Abdul Quddus also has devoted one full paragraph on the responsibility of the press in his judgment also. Coming to what Srinath raised, what happens when during a live show, somebody says something and the broadcast is sought to be made liable. Apart from the self-regulating aspects which Justice Shagdar suggested, I would add that when somebody speaks like this, then the broadcaster may have to step in shortly, at least after the program is over, that they are dissociating themselves with that view. See, if that is so, then the consequences may have to be borne only by the person who espoused that view. If the broadcast is keeping silent, then of course you also will have to face the music. That would be my response.
Can I just come in here, Srinath?
Yes, of course, please.
Yeah, Justice Swaminathan, the only issue is that the person who does the show does it day after day at 9 o'clock. And day after day, he does the same thing because the TRP ratings go up. So we know who the fellows are. I mean, at the end of the day, it becomes commerce. Because, see, then we come to the larger question of the structure of media. Who controls the media today? Who controls the electronic media today?
Very valid point.
Yeah, they're not interested in all this. They are interested in getting more ads. They are interested in TRP. They are not interested in, fair comment. They are not interested in a fair procedure. What do you do? So therefore, the only other way is you need to separate the wheat from the chaff. You need to have a self-regulation. The electronic media journalists should, in a sense, make such a person a pariah. I mean, they should say, sorry, you don't belong to our creed. This is not what we've been taught. If this doesn't happen, how are you going to stop this? Because the other avenue, according to me, is not something which is in the larger interest of the public, because there are some, TV journalists who are doing an outstanding job. So we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I don't know.
I feel self-regulation is a great concept, but on the ground, I'll explain to you why it doesn't work. Many of those primetime anchors happen to be former colleagues of mine, so I know their mind. One of them, in fact, went on record to say that I'm okay with the rat race for TRPs as long as I am the lead rat. That's what he said. He went on record saying that. Now, when it comes to the electronic media, having been a part of it myself, my main problem with the electronic media, with live telecasts, is that there's this presumption of guilt as opposed to the presumption of innocence. The moment an allegation is made against somebody, especially if that person happens to be a celebrity, there's this presumption of guilt and people crucify him. In fact, the Law Commission in its 200th report has spoken about how even after people get vindicated, after they get acquitted, it's a sped arrow. How do you undo the damage done to your reputation? The Law Commission has mentioned that in the 200th report. In fact, even in the Delhi High Court in Justice Swatantra Kumar's case versus Indian Express, spoke about how reportage can prejudicially affect the public mind. It's okay for us to say that judges should be made of sterner stuff, but then there is that public pressure, the public outcry that weighs on your mind. Therefore, I feel that much as people say that Contempt of Courts Act is a Connollian hangover, I do believe that it's required some kind of deterrence. As far as the other aspect of live reportage is concerned, I must weigh in here, Srinath. I was when I was heading NDTV Hindu as its executive editor, I had gone on deputation from the main channel to head this local channel, which was a joint venture with the Hindu newspaper. I faced a criminal defamation case. And that is one of the reasons why it's not the main reason, but one of the reasons why I decided to make the shift from television to law. I was the executive editor of the channel. In a live telecast, there was a raid by the CBI in a 2G related matter. And this person who was raided, whose house was searched, there were reports that his wife worked for a corporate lobbyist. Every newspaper, every channel said that. So did my reporter on the field. Now, it later transpired that the person who filed the case had some bone to pick with this person. He had worked with him earlier or whatever. He filed a criminal defamation case. I had nothing to do with it. Against me, my second in command, who was a senior editor, and the reporter. So we went to the High Court. We got it quashed, primarily on the grounds of vicarious liability. I think that was the first case, if I'm not mistaken, where a High Court ruled and discussed at length the role of an editor. It is not possible to edit what is live. Let's say I'm saying something now and I say something defamatory. I cannot hold HSP partners and make them liable, right? If you cannot control what is live, how can you be criminally liable for a live telecast as long as you don't say it? So therefore, the concept of vicarious liability was used, as well as malicious prosecution in that case. Here, I think it's important for people to understand very often, even in my defamation case, they cited the Press and Registration of Books Act. A lot of people, even when it comes to alleged defamation involving the electronic media, they cite the Press and Registration of Books Act, but it's totally inapplicable to the electronic media. Under that act, there's a person designated who is responsible for the selection of news. The very nature of television journalism doesn't lend itself to editing. As the editor, all I can do is some form of due diligence. I can tell my reporters, this is a code of conduct. This is what you need to say. You need to back it up with some kind of evidence. You need to cross-check your sources. You need to balance the report. In that particular case, in fact, the journalist from that publication, that person who filed it was also a journalist. He had come on my show. When he called up to complain, I said, all right, why don't you come on our show, set the record straight. He came on the show and yet they filed this case. So here I feel, when it comes to self-regulation, Justice Shakhter made a very interesting point. Yes, self-regulation. But then there's this race for TRPs. And therefore, somehow, for some reason, why is that NDTV doesn't have the highest TRPs? A channel that is sober, that speaks truth to power, that has the highest editorial standards. Why are they somewhere at the bottom of the rankings? It's because there is, among viewers, there's this voyeuristic tendency. They like to see people shouting and screaming. I, in fact, have largely reduced my appearances on these debates because having been a debater myself in college, I know that there's no point having these slanging matches where the anchor plays judge, jury, and executioner. The louder you shout, people like to hear. I know of several people who love to watch these 9 p.m. shows, much as they say they're disenchanted. They love to watch people fighting and screaming. Now, that's not journalism, really. But then that gives you TRPs. And that's how these people run. A large section of the media today, I'm sorry to say, a large section they've become cheerleaders. They do not speak truth to power. They become cheerleaders. There's an agenda that's set out. And some of the editorial line that they take is questionable. And these are things that have to be said. But as far as the electronic media is concerned, self-regulation, I'm not sure. In fact, recently there was a very interesting suggestion by the electronic media. And in fact, there are two rival bodies for the National Broadcasters Association. And they said that they need to have something like a sanction to prosecute, that the press council or the electronic media body needs to give some sanction before a case is filed. Now, I must tell you that even in a former judge's case, who was, in fact, the wrong picture was put up in a TV telecast. There again, the editor had to go and face the consequences. Somebody by mistake, again the Sullivan principle applies here, somebody by mistake in the production control room put up a wrong picture of a judge whose name was similar to the one who had filed the case. And then, of course, now there was, I think, the 200 or 300 crore defamation suit filed. So we must understand with the electronic media, the way news is gathered, the way it is reported live, there is scope for error. But as long as there's no reckless disregard for the truth, I think the threshold needs to be much higher when it comes to defamation for the electronic media. Self-regulation may not work, much as it's a laudable concept. It may not work because there's this mad race to get viewership. Your ads, your very sustenance, your survival depends on the ad revenue. And your ad revenue depends on your TRP ratings. That is why NDTV Hindu folded up. It was a great channel. We were the only channel that did not show a Nityananda sex video because we said we are a family channel and unless it is established forensically, we will not show it. I came under flag for doing that. We lost viewers for that. We're the only channel that did issues in public interest in terms of, even simple issues like saving our pavements. The only channel that put out on the ticker blood donor requests. In terms of content, ladies and gentlemen, is not king. Masala is the king, queen, and the kingdom, if you please.
Thanks, Sanjay. So, one aspect which I think emerges from this discussion is there is definitely a line. There is a line between speech which is made with bad intent and other speech. And as the famous quote was made with respect to what is obscene, where the I think it was the House of Lords said that we cannot draw a line defining obscene speech, but if you tell me a particular item of speech, I'll tell you on which side of the line it falls. And I think that there is, in reality, I mean, while recognizing the fundamental importance of freedom of speech, I think that there may also be there may also be a need to recognize a line which, when transgressed, must result in remedy for the affected parties. That's just something which I would place for you in the interest of time. We'll have to move on to the third segment, and this is probably the most important today. Social media is effectively, you have Twitter, you have Facebook, you have Snapchat, you have Instagram. Every individual today is a broadcaster. I can put on my Facebook page or on my Instagram page anything I like, and there will be an audience for it. We also have WhatsApp, and you can say anything you like, and if it is forwarded enough number of times, it somehow seems to gain a sense of legitimacy. Now, Shreya Singh's case resulted in 66A being struck down. But 66A by itself is not enough. Striking down that section by itself is not enough, because you still have the problems posed by reckless social media posts. You have hate posts. Now, where do we draw the line here? And that's something which I would request you all to consider, because free speech is important. What about hate speech? What about fake news? Is this a case where the law of defamation would still have relevance? Justice Shakhtar, back to you again.
See, the point is, as long as you are able to distinguish what is hate speech, and you apply the law as it ought to be applied, there's no difficulty. The problem is the hate speech law, the provisions for hate speech, which are found in your Indian Penal Code, are not applied uniformly. Those provisions are applied, selectively, and that is what causes the problem. Now, if you have a post on a social media, which we again go back to the classic principles, which only offends sentiments of certain people, which are emotive in nature, which are not targeted towards a particular community, correct? Which do not degrade your ethos of plurality. Those are not, according to me, criminally actionable. But the ones which consciously target a particular community, section, erode what we cherish in the Constitution, which is secularism, plurality, fraternity, are perhaps to be dealt with. Now, I don't have to tell you, there were several examples in the recent past where hate speeches which had to be actioned, which the state had to take criminal action, were not taken criminally. There was no recourse to criminal provisions of the law. And those which had nothing to do with this, it's like someone forwards a tweet or which contains a witty remark. It's satire. Just because the dispensation of the day has a thin skin cannot be either classified as hate speech, and therefore you're sort of taken to courts or you're prosecuted. But when you target a community, and this, according to me, Srinath, happens again and again, especially during the time when we are, say, in election fray. It becomes a no holds barred battle, and it's unfortunate that a large majority of people, and I still think in this country there are a lot of people who don't approve of it, but there are silent spectators. There will be a time, as it is happening world over, where people will start coming onto the streets and saying, and it has already happened in India, that this is not me. They don't approve of this behavior. Or we actually don't know. We actually, coming back to electronic media in a sense, if only they could do some of these more constructive programs rather than actually purveying hate speech or what is on the social media. Now you have a particular section, they will tell you what has been tweeted today, even on the electronic media, on the television. So the point is, we just cannot do it. See, for example, if you read the history of section 153A and sorry, it's 295. Also, these are the two sections that you normally invoke, or a sedition section 124A. The history goes back to 1920, when someone had written something about a saint of a particular community. And when he did write about it, there were riots, etc., etc. The judge of the day in Punjab and Haryana, then the High Court said nothing doing. This doesn't come within the ambit of the section. And of course, then the Lahore High Court took a different view in another matter. So the point here is, you need to first of all be clear what is hate speech. Everything is labeled as hate speech, and what is supposed to be labeled as hate speech is not labeled as hate speech. And therefore we have this problem. Which is why in Shreya Singhal, the court struck down 66A. Now some people say, striking down 66A has caused this problem. You're not able to prosecute people who are, forwarding these messages on WhatsApp or whatever social media platform they use. But the court was cognizant of making a distinction between the two. That every offending, disagreeable WhatsApp message cannot come within the purview of 66A. So therefore, actually it is the administrators of the law who need to be fair, who need to be what we expect them to be. But when they are not, it is like what Ambedkar said about the Constitution. The Constitution is going to be good or bad, it depends on the people who administer the Constitution. I'm just paraphrasing what he said. So that's the problem here. That's my comment.
Justice Swaminathan, please.
Srinath?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. See, now we are living in Corona times. The government is saying live with Corona. Same way, we have to live with this fake news. It is the order of the day. I have a question for both Justice Shagdar as well as Sanjay Pinto. I read an article in Live Law by a Nalsar student that many countries, particularly Singapore, have enacted laws to protect people from online fake news, Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. Singapore had passed such an act in 2019. So I want to know from Justice Shagdar as well as Sanjay Pinto whether a legislative response is warranted. That is my first question. My second question is, recently, of course, if Shagdar would feel embarrassed, let him not respond to it. Let Sanjay Pinto and Srinath alone respond to it.
You first articulate the question, then I'll tell you I'm embarrassed.
See, Justice Rajiv Sahai Endla had recently dismissed a suit by a former MP from Tamil Nadu. See, all of us know the facts. This MP is a lady. She was found to be on intimate terms with an MP from a rival political party. It was appearing in every social media. She wanted injunction to take down those offending photographs. But then Justice Rajiv Sahai Endla said the electorate are entitled to know how their leader is hobnobbing with the other person behind closed doors. I felt this definition of public interest was going a little too far. See, now I must say, I have very great respect for Rajiv Sahai Endla. See, in fact, one of his judgments on reservation was overruled by a DB. I chose to follow Rajiv Sahai Endla and I ignored the DB judgment. I have great respect for him. But I felt in this particular case, his definition of public interest had gone a little too far. And how it impacts on privacy concerns, that also must be taken note of. These are my two questions.
So, Sanjay, do you want to go first or should I? Why don't you go first and then
I'll answer that embarrassing question first. I, for one, believe, in fact, I said this, in fact, in my legal column, I had written about this when Ms. Jayalalitha was hospitalized, that there is a difference between public interest and public curiosity. Peeping Toms have no place when it comes to public interest. I'm very clear about that. I would respectfully disagree with Justice Enlaw there, although I'm a great fan of some of his judgments, especially the beautiful analogy he gave on WhatsApp, the liability of WhatsApp administrators, where he compared newsprint suppliers to WhatsApp administrators and said, are you going to prosecute newsprint suppliers if something defamatory comes up in a newspaper? That said, I believe that personal lives, should be out of the public domain in that sense, as long as it does not affect the person's performance as a public servant. And I think personal lives are a definite no-no. As far as the social media is concerned, I'll come very quickly here. I have two issues. One is there has to be, in fact, Justice Shakta raised a very valid point. How do you define hate speech? I believe that there has to be a distinction between dissent and abuse. The problem with the social media is that here again, there's no regulation. We are governed by the Bar Council as lawyers. Doctors are governed by the Medical Council. Advertisers are governed by the ASCI, Advertising Standards Council. Insurance companies are governed by IRDA. Who governs the social media? Every user of the social media has his own editor-in-chief. There's no question of vetting whatever they choose to put out, and it has a force multiplier effect. Each time something is retweeted, that actually constitutes republication in my view. Secondly, anonymity. I can create, in fact, Twitter handles in the names of various people and start tweeting things. If you have to get a mobile phone SIM, you'll have to produce proof of address, identity. They come and check it. They do a physical verification. But to open a social media account which is potentially dangerous, which you can spread communal hatred, you can cause a riot. There's absolutely no authentication. You need nothing. You just need an email ID and bong. I mean, you're ready. Pronto, you're ready. So therefore, this is an issue, I feel. As far as personal lives, public interest is not just what the public is interested in. If it serves a genuine purpose, then yes. So as far as personal lives are concerned, peeping Toms, as I said, have no place.
What about legislative response, like Singapore? Are you for it?
Lordship, I believe as far as 66A was concerned, I think that particular provision was badly drafted because it had certain loosely worded terms, loose terms like annoyance. And this actually gained a lot of notoriety after that incident in Mumbai, where two young college girls, during Bal Thackeray's funeral, one of them actually wrote a very critical post saying, why should the city be shut down? There was another classmate of hers who went and liked that post, and the two of them were detained. And of course, it was being misused. But I, for one, believe that we do need some provision because the social media can be an industry of hatred. If you look at the community standards of the social media, now, fortunately, Facebook, for instance, has a parameter called false news, not fake news, but false news. Twitter has a hate speech where you can actually flag content and they can take it down. But broadly, by and large, now you find that there is a difference between Twitter and Facebook with regard to the US president's comments. They have taken diametrically opposite stands. So I think community standards have to be much stricter. Otherwise, there's no other means of redressal when it comes to defamation of the social media. Somebody puts something, it's retweeted, everybody goes by that. Anything negative that is said about somebody gains traction. So that force multiplier effect actually calls for some sort of regulation, not self-regulation, but real regulation on the social media. You need some kind of regulatory body, and there perhaps has to be some kind of a legislative prescription for that.
Thanks, Sanjay. We are heading dangerously close to the hard stop time, so I think we should start going to the Q&A part now.
I just wanted to answer that. And
I am waiting for Shakta's response.
Yeah. I'll give a response because I can't run away from what Somi has said. Insofar as let me take judgment delivered by one of my colleagues. I haven't had the occasion to read the judgment, but I take it broadly. Somi has summed it up that the suit was dismissed, etc. So Sanjay made a valid point that there has to be a distinction between public interest and public curiosity. Personally, I also believe that as long as whatever a person is doing in his private life is not affecting his discharge of public duties, that by itself should not be a cause for grief for him. It applies to people across the board, whether it is politicians, whether it is bureaucrats, even judges, because everyone doesn't have a saintly life. You've been at the bar, you've been part of the society as a child, as an adolescent. You may have made mistakes, but now over a period of time you've matured. You've come onto the bench. I'm taking an example of a judge. Should that weigh him down if he's discharging his duties? Take it a little further. Suppose a judge has fallen out with a spouse, whether a lady judge or a male judge, and the husband and wife are separated. He has affection for someone else. That lady is not influencing his work. Should the press or someone put it in public domain, embarrass him, even if it is not affecting his duties on a day-to-day basis? But yes, if that lady is influencing judicial work, surely he needs to be called out. So the Indian press all along had actually adhered to this. We've known of eminent politicians, not now, prior to independence, who had extramarital affairs. It is not as if the press was not aware of.
The Tamil Nadu is known for it. Tamil Nadu is known for it.
Yeah, correct. So a more evolved society, Swami, where it shouldn't bother them as long as it is not impacting his duties, which have been given to him as a public servant. But having said so, let me give you an example, because this is a debate which has not occurred now only in our country, but it has occurred all across. If you would remember, Pinto and Swaminathan and Srinath, that we had Gary Hart's presidential, he put his hat in the ring to be the president of the United States for some time in 1988. And the press disclosed that he had been having extramarital affairs. Extramarital, not one, several. His wife was aware, it seems. One is not clear. But if someone is interested, there's a movie on this where, the suggestion is that the wife was aware, but she was carrying on because, for the family or whatever. The reporters who reported on this also had a difference of point of view. One said, it is not our business. The other seems to have said that if I have to elect the next president of the United States, I need to know what is his view about family. I need to know how he treats women. Was he honest with his spouse? It's not about having an extramarital affair. Public interest is perhaps a wider term. Does it concern the public? Not in a voyeuristic way, but in a way, like I gave you the example of Gary Hart, that it could affect his job. I need to know the candidate. So there is a point of view that perhaps Justice Andelaw articulated the rationale. I have not read the judgment, but I am just giving you a thought where if someone is to be elected tomorrow as the Prime Minister of this country or the President of this country, but he has, say, treated someone unfairly, does it in a sense tell me about his personality, and therefore is he the candidate that I should be voting for? You could debate on this endlessly. So Swami, yours is one view, and Pinto, and there are a lot of people who have another view that we need to know. So it's not as clear as one would like it to be, because there are people, and both views have their merits and demerits. So on the fake news, all of us know that it's a problem. The difficulty again is because, like I told you about broadcasting, once you start this, where do you end? And therefore, and the technology doesn't permit this, however much you may put law on the statute book, the technology is such, you will not be able to intervene. It is spread, and therefore, it is only after it is spread or it has come in public domain that the social media platforms can then be asked to take it down. So if you have a law to the extent which obliges the social media platforms to take it down once a body says that this particular post is fake, or say in the category, truly a category of hate speech, then they should be obliged by law to take it down. Now, various social media platforms, as Sanjay has informed, Twitter has a policy, YouTube has a policy, Facebook has a policy, but they are excruciatingly laborious. You have to first send an email, then there is a body. In fact, they've said, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Sanjay, you correct me if I'm wrong, Facebook has set up a body of eminent people who would look into it. You know, this takes enormously long. We need a quicker resolution to this. But if you're asking me practically, I don't think technologically it is possible to stop it, because you would have your servers anywhere in the world. At the time you trace them, it is out. So that's my view. Sorry, I took a little longer, but that's my. We can extend it. We agreed to about 15 minutes more, right? I don't know.
Let me just jump into the questions. The first question is from Harishankar to Justice Shakdar. In an ongoing case, reporting comments of judges and trying to predict the outcome and generating public opinion is a serious menace. How can such a thing be stopped with self-regulation?
Hari, the problem again is that the standards of the bar has fallen. There were times, and I'm not saying that now that I'm a judge and perhaps they've been there for more than a decade, and therefore I'm saying standard. But when I was there as well, and that's in the late 80s, when I started my career as a lawyer, senior advocates would never ever give interviews. It now seems that there is an argument in court and then there is a submission or an oration on television before the media. It's very tempting. You thrust a mic, you like to see your picture on the television, you can tell your family the next day, listen, I was on television. By the way, they could accuse us of the same thing today. But then again, what we are accusing the media of, we are doing the same thing to the judges, even though we belong to the same fraternity and know that is not right. Because you don't know which way the judge is going. The judge's initial comments in a case are not often his final decisions. When the matter gets closed, you cogitate, you think about it. At times, even when you are ready with your judgment, you go over it. And there have been cases where people have looked at the file and said, listen, I think I'm going wrong. And therefore, redrafted or recrafted the whole thing, which is why there is a provision for review. We often review our own view. So for lawyers, this is a menace. Harishankar, you're right. But then again, I'm a great believer in self-regulation. If you start clamming it down, you would get a reaction which will be, worse than the malady you're trying to cure. One way was that you would have a very strong bar council. Unfortunately, it's a topic for discussion for another day. We don't have robust mechanisms, and if we don't manage our affairs, there will be a time where someone will take over this job function as well. So I think the leaders of the bar need to, mentor their juniors, because there is this tradition of seniors and juniors. Mentor their juniors about the ethics and the traditions of the bar. Law juniors will learn with the tumble and in the courts and rough and tumble of the courts, going to the courts and seeing how the matters operate. That they will learn, but they need to learn. They need to be mentored. When you are properly mentored, it all depends which stables you come out of. You've seen, why is there a difference between two sets of lawyers? The difference is where you are mentored. Unfortunately, there is a problem. the seniors don't allow people to come and accept by way of reference. So lots of youngsters who have great potential miss the bus because they can't get to an eminent seniors chamber. So Harishankar, have to live with it. You have to speak amongst yourselves.
There's one follow-on question by Bhaskar on the same question. What do you think then about, while decriminalizing defamation, having heavy damages, punitive costs, and a fast-track trial procedure, tribunalization, and thereby, through the fear of heavy damages, make the media more accountable to report facts rather than fiction? You think that's a better way of regulating them instead of criminal action?
Yeah, I kind of agree that the best way to, the tort law in our country is very, very underdeveloped. And the tort law needs to be strengthened. In fact, they need to bring in legislation for that. But I don't believe again in having a tribunal, because I heard a view, in fact, by my former senior, in whose chamber I have, at the occasion of sort of deviling. But I don't think tribunals are the way forward. But then again, the fundamental tests of whether something is defamatory or not will remain the same. I mean, you cannot lampoon the press and get damages against them just because there is an error in the story, because the Sullivan principle should apply. And therefore, even though it's a civil action, which is much preferred over a criminal action, where he must be cognizant of the fact that if he's, entering an area where it's a complete falsehood or it is being done with malice, that he could end up with damages. But he should not be lampooned for the fact that he made an error. So those tests will apply, I'm sure. But yes, criminal action, according to me, is something that if it can be avoided by having a law which which subjects them to only civil action by way of damages. But then, are they going to take that call? That's the question.
Thank you. Next question is from Priya to Justice Swaminathan. There seems to be a thin line between free speech, hate speech leading to lynching, and there are duties and responsibilities of citizens. One person's right is another's duty. Should there be a regulation surrounding social media where everyone is an influencer?
Though Justice Shagdar is of the view that legislation may not be an answer, I feel it's better we have a law on the same lines which Singapore has recently enacted. We need to have a legislation in place to regulate social media. It's really going out of hand. That's my stand.
Thank you so much. There's a question from a retired judge who happens to be a related party to me. So I'll just state the question. It is to all the panelists. The thin skin of the state is not revealed only by defamation or contempt, but also by withholding advertisements which have a choking effect. What are your views on this?
Yeah, Cyril, we don't need to hazard a guess, but we know who. He's a dear friend. Yeah, that's precisely what I said in the beginning. Yeah, when you choke advertisements, you are in effect choosing one between the other, and that's how you propagate the paper which gives you the best, the most happy news from the point of view of the dispensation, as against that which doesn't. So, yeah, that's a very, very. It's not even innovative any longer. It's been happening for a very long time. That certain papers are starved of advertisements, and therefore their revenue falls. I think Sanjay will be able to tell us, papers like Hindu and all, or I don't know, other papers in say West Bengal, or the smaller papers, regional papers, they suffer when they don't get advertisements. So media diversity is important. So the point is this, the point that I made in the beginning, you need to have an egalitarian media structure, which is, I mean, who controls the media? Like I'm told, the Guardian and Washington, the Guardian, which is controlled by a trust. Now, so therefore, that's a egalitarian control structure. And you need to have media diversity by giving advertisements, having some law. Here, actually, you should, Swami, I think, have a law where government ads are distributed equitably between all newspapers. In fact, one of the criticisms, I'm going back to Sakar. One of the criticisms of Sakar papers is it's cited as one of those locus classicals for free speech. One of the criticisms of Sakar papers is that they missed one significant point, which is when the government said that newspapers have to cost X, they were trying to ensure media diversity, perhaps, which got missed in the whole process of saying that you cannot interfere with what the newspaper is going to cost to the people. So, I think you need a law for that. It's high time we had a law for that.
My one-line response will be the norms that we apply to distribution of state largesse. The very same approach should be adopted in the case of media advertisements also. I fully agree with Justice Shankar.
I believe that the person who plays the piper calls a tune. And I agree with Justice Shankar there that there has to be some equitable distribution of ads. But I am told that they go by the circulation of newspapers when it comes to allocation of advertisements, government advertisements, which form a large chunk of revenue of paper. So very often in reality, you'll find that if a particular paper goes a little overboard, then the one way to control them, to muzzle them, would be to suspend advertisements. And then you have the entire newspaper owners trooping to the powers that be, trying to make amends. This is true of the electronic as well as the print media, trying to make amends, as it were, with in the corridors of power, so that they'll get those ads back to survive. So that's an economic reality, and now especially during in a post-COVID scenario, that's going to come to the fore a lot more. It's going to be more pronounced now.
Just as advertisements is an incentive, positive incentive, prosecution can be a negative incentive. The Congress government unleashed raids against Indian Express. BJP government unleashed raids against Outlook. That is another way is also there. There's a negative disincentive.
Tell me, Sanjay, sorry, Shri, can I just ask Sanjay and Swami a point? But tell me, Sanjay, given the present state of the way digital media is writing and propagating news, what is the future of print media? As a matter of fact, today, except for some newspapers, the digital media is doing an outstanding job because they don't have, they also need money, they also ask for donations. But, they may at some stage completely wipe out print media.
The reality today is that all newspapers and magazines have a robust online presence. In order to take on, it's perhaps a fallout of the emergence of the digital media. It's very difficult to actually monetize digital content today. That's what I'm told. But with several newspapers and magazines having their own online presence, having their own active social media presence where they tweet all their stories, you'll be surprised to know that there are some journalists, print media journalists, who have more followers on their Twitter handles than the actual number of readers of their newspapers. So many of them put out their links first on their social media handles. And in fact, there will a time will, I'm sure, come where even hiring of journalists will also hinge on their the number of followers that they have, how popular they are, how they'll be able to get the word out, because all this will add up ultimately in terms of the advertising pie.
I think this is a very interesting point of view. It brings us back to the fact that every man is now a broadcaster. Yes. Social media has given the kind of reach which only the broadcast moguls of yesteryear could dream of. There's a question from Suhrit Parthasarthi to the panel. He says that the American journalist Liebling once said the freedom of the press is limited to those who own one. There are a number of political parties who own media establishments. We support this by appealing to Article 19(1)(a). But isn't this counterintuitive? Sakal papers might support this position, but might be critical to place restrictions on anti-competitive ownership. Media ownership must promote free speech and not restrict it. What is the panel's view?
I completely agree with Surit. So therefore, that's the criticism of Sakal papers.
Correct.
It actually, in a sense, prevented, media diversity. And the thought that goes into that question is, yes, today the structures of control and regulation of media are in the hands of people who perhaps don't care too much for free speech. And we started our discussion, and in the middle we did say that this is more about TRPs. So therefore, something like what The Guardian does, and I'm told, as I said just now a few minutes ago, that you should have a concept of a trust managing and controlling newspapers, and trust comprising of eminent public people. If you have only media moguls controlling it, you have deep pockets, and this is only side business. Even if the newspaper or the television has a balance sheet which is in the red, they make money elsewhere, because this gives them the power to negotiate with the government of the day, which they otherwise wouldn't have had. So therefore, losses here mean nothing to them. So the way forward is to have public trust controlling the structure of media.
Sanjay, can you talk about paid news, Sanjay?
Yes, I believe the media...
On paid news, can you talk about paid news? Paid news.
Yeah, Surit has a follow-up
the
question.
medium is a message. In Tamil Nadu, Lordships, we have almost every political party in the state owns a TV channel. So there, as I said, the medium is a message. This, in a sense, is if you're going to withhold, if your advertisement, government ads are going to hinge on your editorial stance, then I'm just wondering whether that actually would be a form of paid news. So if you toe the line, you'll get government ads. If you don't, we'll stop them. That's a form of censorship, according to me. And as rightly pointed out, this was laid down in several judgments in the past as well. I think how many of us, the question to be asked is, how many of us are willing to pay for news, the news we consume? That's why a lot of, in fact, you have a lot of good websites like, for instance, News Laundry, run by Madhu Trihan. When they're very open about it, they say, how many of you are willing to pay for news? I mean, it's important. You have Boom Live, you've got Alt News, you have several new sites that actually call out fake news. In fact, much as I am critical of the social media, I'm also a great fan of the social media, because you can even call out fake news on the social media. You cannot stifle something. You may be able to stop, publication. You may be able to indulge in pre-censorship on the mainstream media, but you can't stop the social media. You cannot buy the social media, because you don't know who's going to come up with what. That's why it's impossible almost to have any blanket ban. So I think the social media has its role to play. As I said, the force multiplier effect cuts both ways. It can also call out effectively fake news. It can call out paid news. But at the same time, there are also paid social media handles. So it's almost free for all. Free speech has now become free for all.
There's one question which I think is troubling Bhaskar, Aditya, and myself. I'll kind of combine all three questions and ask it in one. Now, throughout the last 1.5 hours, we've been talking about state prosecution and the person who's affected by what he or she perceives as defamation, prosecuting a media person or the publisher. There is a parallel trend we are seeing, definitely in Tamil Nadu, and I'm sure in other parts of India as well, where, for example, either a news article is published or a statement is made in an interview, or even there is a scene in a movie which offends a section of people. It's not directed against them. There's nothing said about them. But let's say, for example, there's a movie about, where lawyers are portrayed as villainous people. So a group of lawyers lawyers go ahead and file PILs, and that without going through the trouble of CRPC or defamation or 499 or anything else, you have the same chilling effect which a prosecution would have. So this is probably because you have publications which are made without viewing the individual cultural context of different people. So is there a case to interpret 19.2 the terms of morality in 19.2 more subjectively as subjective to the listener? Should we what is the panel's view about these kinds of actions where people are offended by what they see or hear, and it's not directed against them, but they still go ahead, they prosecute or they file PILs? This super censorship, as it's called. Sanjay, please go first.
Okay, so I lost some of your audio in the middle, Srinath, but what I've broadly heard, what you were asking. Yes, in terms of filing PILs and all that, I think the right to free speech at some level also includes the right to offend. And these reasonable restrictions, I often give people this example. When I was a school kid, I remember reading these essays, A.G. Gardner's essays on the rule of the road, where it says the freedom to swing my arm ends at the tip of your nose. But today, I believe that many of us are becoming like the fictional character Pinocchio, where our noses are growing longer and longer, and there's hardly any place for us to swing our arm. That said, I think free speech is often, people only talk about 19.1a. The common man out there isn't really concerned about 19.2 for some reason. That free speech, they need to understand, is not absolute. It is hemmed in by those reasonable restrictions. And all those reasonable restrictions, and even in defamation, those 10 exceptions that you have, I want to even go back to an earlier point that was raised in this discussion about civil defamation and about damages. In the UK, for instance, I'm told by my friends that a civil defamation suit can be wrapped up in 6 months. And the damages are exemplary. You can even go bankrupt here. Here they go on for years and years. Even if there are different ways to legally short-circuit it. You file a Order 7, Rule 11 application to reject the claim. There are so many safeguards here. So I think today a balanced approach is required. The right to free speech should not mean the right to defame someone. Responsible free speech is something that we need to, that seems to be the goal today. We need to have responsible free speech. Another point I'd like to make here is that when the media goes wrong, assuming it is not defamation, it's an error, but it affects somebody's reputation. The correction that is carried out, especially in the print media, even in the electronic media, the clarification or the correction that is carried out is not with the same prominence as the original error. So a person's reputation then, as I said earlier, it's a sped arrow. I think equal prominence needs to be given to the correction as in the same manner as the original article or news item appeared.
Justice Swaminathan?
Sanjay's metamorphosis appears to be complete now. Sanjay's metamorphosis. Okay, now answering Srinath's question, only 2 lines. See, these PILs are rather simulated ones. They pretend to be as if they are offended. And the whole exercise is to gain attention. That's why I look at it.
Justice Shankar?
So, first of all, should someone be entertaining a PIL on this is a moot question. We throw out so many PILs, and these PILs can also be thrown out, and you can easily tell them, make recourse to the alternate remedy that they have. But having said so, there are pressure groups and there are pressure groups. There are pressure groups within the fraternity. When they come, it perhaps becomes a little difficult. But even if you have to hear a PIL such as this, the test, as we've all discussed, can't be any different. I mean, every offending remark or something that affects you emotionally can't be the basis of saying that a particular book, movie should not go on. But the hard fact is, it's a numbers game. I mean, even publishers have collapsed under this pressure. We know about Wendy Doniger's book being banned on Hinduism, Alternative Way. I don't remember the title correctly fully. Or, for example, the book on Shivaji by James Lane. the book was, the publishers now pulp the book. They don't want to face these angry mobs who belong to a particular group or a school of thought. So similarly, if you have in a movie, I believe there was this Hindi movie, I don't know, I'm sure in Tamil Nadu also you would have had such instances where lawyers were shown in a particular, they were not shown in a good light. And then you had people coming to court saying, this sort of affects the entire community. The point of all this, the entire situation is that perhaps people have stopped having humor in their life. I mean, people don't look at situations, the lighter side of the situation. I mean, all of us do those funny things which are then depicted on reel. So courts need to remind people time and again that, this business of getting sensitive is not good enough. I remember a PIL was, look at what the court did. I remember a PIL was entertained on Sikh jokes. Give me a break. Can you entertain a PIL on Sikh jokes? Yeah, the Sikhs laugh on those jokes themselves. They're jokes about the Irish. So therefore, if courts start encouraging these kind of actions, then of course we have a problem. I think all of us, even on the bench, need a reorientation on this area of the law. You know what Swami said? The law is all there. You need to enforce it. Enforce it equitably and with a heavy hand when it's required. So that's the way to go about it. Thank you.
There was a PIL in Tamil Nadu about nicknames for prisoners. I remember many years ago, I actually covered it as a story as a journalist. Nicknames given to prisoners was a PIL in that.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much. We've gone more than 45 minutes beyond what we were permitted to go. So we will close it here. Hari, can you please take it forward?
Thank you, Srinath. So this topic is so vast, and we could have just gone on and on, and we wouldn't have known the time. But anyway, especially with such an erudite panel, all of you sharing your views so freely. This was such a welcome, and we were really enlightened by all the exchanges that you've had. So thank you, Justice Shakdar. Thank you, Justice Swaminathan. Despite your busy administrative as well as judicial work, and we are snatching your Saturday evening away from you. This is probably one day when you would like to take rest, with the Sunday coming up. So thank you both very much for being with us. Thank you, Sanjay, also. Sanjay, you're wearing many hats now, a lawyer, a columnist, a public speaker. So you are much, much more busier than any of us. So thank you, Sanjay, for sharing your views and being on the panel. Thank you all, and thank all the participants. There are some honorable judges of the Madras High Court here, and all the other learned brothers and sisters from the bar. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harishankar. Thank you, Srinath. Thank you, Swami. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Srinivasan.
Thank you.